Hello everyone, today's video is going to be about Black history. It's Black History Month, and it's very important that we learn and talk about Black history. Black history is generally not taught or talked about, and therefore to celebrate I'm going to talk about 8 important Black people in our history. These people may not be talked about to the full extent in history textbooks, so therefore I'm going to talk about them a little bit more and give you some things that you probably don't know. As I was doing my research for this video, I did learn a lot of things about these people, so hopefully you find this to be very interesting. Some of these people you may have heard of, and some of these people you may not have, but regardless, it's important to celebrate Black History Month and study Black history. Before I continue with my video, I want to let you know that all my sources are listed in the description. The first person I'm going to talk about is Miss Major Griffin Gracie, or just simply put, Miss Major. She is an important trans activist that is very important for today. Miss Major Griffin Gracie was born in Chicago on October 25th, 1940, and was assigned male at birth. In her youth, she participated in drag balls, and came out as transgender as a teenager in the late 1950s. Due to serious transphobia, she had to have somebody by her side to avoid dangerous situations. Also, she had to rely on the black market for hormones during her transition. For over 20 years, she was homeless and was a sex worker, and participated in other illegal acts such as theft to support herself. She tried going to college, but was kicked out of 2 colleges due to gender identity, and then she moved to New York City. On June 27, 1969, she attended a meeting with a friend at the Stonewall Inn during the riot and decided to join in, but was struck in the head by a police officer, and she was taken into custody. She went to prison multiple times in the 1970s and credits her radical political views on abolition and black liberation to her experiences in the prison system. Also in prison, a corrections officer broke her jaw. Miss Major Griffin Gracie moved to San Diego in 1978 and organized grassroots movements and community efforts. She initially worked at a local food bank and later provided direct services for incarcerated or homeless trans women. In the 1990s, she moved to San Francisco Bay Area and served on multiple HIV/AIDS organizations following the AIDS epidemic. In 2003, she began working at the Transgender Variant Intersex Justice Project, the TGIJP, shortly after it was founded as the executive director. She led efforts to support transgender women who have been imprisoned, particularly women of color. Both within her organization, she has fought against criminalization and police brutality. She also led direct service efforts and personalized care to incarcerated trans women of color. And in 2015, Miss Major Griffin Gracie officially retired. The next person I'll be talking about is Bayard Rustin, who's one of my favorites. Bayard Rustin was born in Westchester, Pennsylvania on March 17, 1912. From his grandparents, his family had Quaker values in which his words were based on the concept of single human family and the belief that all members of that family are equal. Throughout his early childhood, he believed that his grandparents were his parents, and his mother to be his sister, since she was very young. Bayard Rustin played high school football and staged a sit-in at a restaurant that would only serve his white teammates and not him. In 1937, Bayard Rustin moved to New York City after going to Wilberforce University and Cheney State Teachers College, now Cheney State University of Pennsylvania. Enrolled in a city college, he sang and also joined the Youth Communist League. But he soon quit the party after he was ordered to stop protesting racial segregation in the United States Armed Forces. Rustin then joined the pacifist Reverend A.J. Muss Fellowship of Reconciliation. When FOR members in Chicago launched the Congress of Racial Equality in 1942, he traveled around the country to speak out. But 2 years later, he was arrested for failing to appear before his draft board and refusing alternative service as a conscientious objector. Sentenced to 3 years, he served 26 months, angering authorities with his desegregationist protests and gayness to a point where they transferred him to a high-security prison. Once released, he embarked on Core's 1947 Journey of Reconciliation, the early version of Freedom Rides, to test the Supreme Court ruling in Morgan v. Virginia that any state forcing segregation on buses crossing state lines would be in violation of the Commerce Clause. However, that resulted in him becoming arrested in North Carolina and sentenced to work on a chain gang for several weeks. Gandhi was one of Bayard Rustin's biggest influences, and he traveled to India in 1948 to attend a World Pacifist Conference after Gandhi had been assassinated earlier that year. In January 1953, he was arrested on lewd conduct and vagrancy charges, allegedly for sexual act involving two white men in a car, and became a registered sex offender. In other words, he got arrested for being gay. With the FBI's file on Rustin expanding, the FOR demanded his resignation. In 1956, on the advice of labor leader and activist A. Philip Randolph, Rustin traveled to Alabama to send support to Martin Luther King Jr. and the Montgomery bus boycott. While remaining out of the spotlight, he introduced Martin Luther King Jr. to Gandhi's teaching while writing public publicity materials and organizing carpools, and he helped MLK organize the Southern Christian Leadership Congress in 1956 and 1957. Bayard Rustin reached one of the lowest points in his career in 1960 when Representative Adam Clayton Powell Jr. of New York, angry that MLK and Rustin were planning a march outside the DNC, tried to convince MLK to drop Rustin. MLK then called off the march and distanced himself from Rustin. The idea for the 1963 March on Washington again came from A. Philip Randolph, and in 1962 recruited Bayard Rustin, and the two began to make plans, this time to commemorate the centennial signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. Bayard Rustin traveled to Alabama to meet with MLK and expanded the march's focus to jobs and freedom, and from the march's headquarters in New York, he looked forward to leading the planning coalition of the Big Six civil rights movements, the CNCC, CORE, SCLC, National Urban League, NAACP, and Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Roy Wilkins of the NAACP refused to allow Rustin to be the frontman, and Randolph agreed to serve as the march's director. He wrote the organizing manual number 2 for the march, which laid out things like how to arrive and what the demands were for the march. While launching the A. Philip Randolph Institute in 1964, Rustin found himself embroiled in Democratic politics at the 1964 convention in Atlantic City, where he warned delegates of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to back down when LBJ made a deal to seat the state's conservative wing. For one day in 1964, he directed a one-day student boycott of New York City's public schools in protest against racial imbalances in that system. As memories of the march faded and movement entered its more militant phase, Rustin's coziness with the Democratic Party power structure angered proponents of black power and also alienated anti-war activists when he failed to call for the immediate withdrawal of troops from Vietnam. Despite tensions with other black activists, he remained engaged in the struggle for justice. When Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, he participated in a memorial march and demanded economic justice for sanitation workers. During the 1980s, he opened up publicly about being gay that he had sublimated since the 1950s and advocated for more gays to come out, and also worked to bring the AIDS crisis to the NAACP's attention. Bayard Rustin died of a ruptured appendix on August 24, 1987, in New York City. He was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2013, and he was pardoned for his conviction in 2020. The next person I'll be talking about is Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers was born on July 2, 1925, in Mississippi. Evers joined the U.S. Army in 1943 to fight in World War II, but soon found that his skin color allowed him no freedom when he and his friends were forced away at gunpoint from voting in a local election. After fighting in the Army, he took advantage of the GI Bill and majored in business administration at Alcorn College, now Alcorn State University. While there, he dated Merle Beasley, and after a year, they got married on December 24, 1951. He moved to Mount Bayou, where C.R.M. Howard hired him to sell insurance for his company. He also served as president of the Regional Council of Negro Leadership, a civil rights organization, and got crucial training into activism. He helped to organize RCNL's boycott of service stations that refused to allow blacks to use their restrooms. In February 1954, he applied to the then segregated University of Mississippi Law School and got rejected and became the focus of an NAACP campaign to desegregate the school, a case ended by Brown versus Board of Education. He became the NAACP's field officer of Mississippi and traveled around the state trying to recruit new members. After moving to Jackson, he helped get James Meredith enrolled at the University of Mississippi in 1962. In the last weeks of his life, he was the target of several death threats after his public investigation of the murder of Emmett Till and support of his fellow Mississippi rights activist Clyde Kennard after his conviction of theft charges. His house was firebombed in May 1963. In June 1963, a local television station granted him a short speech outlining goals of the Jackson movement, and following the speech, death threats increased. On June 12, 1963, he pulled into his driveway after returning from an integration meeting, and emerging from his car, he was shot in the back by Byron Beckwith and died. He was buried on June 19th in Arlington National Cemetery, and he received full military honors. The next person that I will be discussing is Rosa Parks. She was born Rosa Lewis Macaulay on February 4th, 1913, in Tuskegee, Alabama, and her parents separated when she was 2 years old. Her mother moved to Pine Level, and both of her grandparents were former slaves and strong advocates of racial equality, and the family lived on Edwards Farm. Her childhood brought experiences with racial discrimination and activism for racial equality. In 1929, she left school to attend to both her sick grandmother and mother back in Pine Level. She got a job at a shirt factory in Montgomery and married Raymond Parks, an active member in the NAACP, in 1932. After graduating high school with her husband's support, she became actively involved in civil rights issues by joining the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP and served as its secretary. On December 1st, 1955, after working at a Montgomery department store, she was arrested for refusing a bus driver's orders to give up her seat to a white passenger despite her being in the right section of the bus. 3 of the other black passengers that were asked to do so complied, but she was arrested and later released on bail. At her trial, she was greeted by a crowd of hundreds of supporters and was found guilty of violating a local ordinance and was fined $10. Rosa Parks was not the only black person who refused to give up her seat. That happened many, many times. The reason why she's famous for doing it is because she was a member of the NAACP. That's why. The response to this was black people participated in the Montgomery bus boycott that was backed by Martin Luther King Jr. and the Montgomery Improvement Association, and it was a huge success, as the buses had crippling finances, ending with a Supreme Court ruling that declared segregation on public transit systems to be unconstitutional. Because of the success of the Montgomery bus boycott and the rise in MLK's prominence, she was called the mother of the civil rights movement. After the boycott, she suffered hardship as she lost her job and her husband was fired. They moved to Detroit, and Parks worked as a secretary and receptionist in the U.S. Representative John Coyer's office, and served on the board of Planned Parenthood Federation of America. She was so active in the NAACP. In 1987, with friend Elaine Eason Steele, she founded the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute for Self-Development, which introduced people to important civil rights in bus tours. In 2004, she was diagnosed with progressive dementia, and she died on October 24, 2005, in her apartment in Detroit. Her death was marked by multiple memorial services, and the chapel that she and her husband were buried in was renamed the Russell L. Parks Freedom Chapel. In 1996, Bill Clinton awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The next person I'll be talking about is W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois was born on February 23, 1868, in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. In 1884, he graduated from high school as valedictorian after attending school with white people. In 1885, he moved to Nashville, Tennessee to attend Fisk University, where he first encountered the Jim Crow laws and began analyzing the deep troubles of racism. He received his Bachelor of Arts at Fisk University and entered Harvard as a junior. From 1892 to 1894, he pursued graduate studies at the University of Berlin on a Slater Fund scholarship, and he was exposed to different political perspectives that he would advocate for the rest of his life. He served 2 years as professor of Greek and Latin at Wilberforce University in Ohio, and he became the first black person to receive a doctorate from Harvard. In 1896 to 1897, he became assistant instructor in sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, and from 1897 to 1910, he served as the professor of economics and history at Atlanta University, where he organized conferences called the Atlanta University Studies of the Negro Problem. While there, he rose to national prominence when he opposed Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise, which was an agreement that asserted the vocational education for black people was more valuable to them than social advantages like higher education or political office. In 1900, he attended the first Pan-African Conference in London. In 1905, he founded the Niagara Movement, an African-American protest group of scholars and professionals that opposed Booker T. Washington's stance. He served as the General Secretary. In 1909, he was one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, and from 1910 to 1934, he served as its director of publicity and research and was the editor of The Crisis, its monthly magazine. From 1910 to 1912, he was a member of the Socialist Party after being drawn to socialist leanings by 1905. His first novel, The Quest of the Silver Fleece, came out in 1911, and his second one, Dark Princess, a Romance, came out in 1928. In 1934, he resigned from the NAACP because he charged that the organization was focused on the interests of black bourgeoisie, ignored the masses, and he returned to Atlanta University to serve as chairman of the Department of Sociology. In 1935, one of his best works, Black Reconstruction of America, 1860-1880, was published, and it was criticized for his Marxist interpretation of the Reconstruction. In 1939, his elaborate history of black people, Black Folk, Then and Now, was published. In 1994, he returned to the NAACP, but left after 4 years. In 1951, after being identified with pro-Russian causes, he was indicted in 1951 as an unregistered agent of foreign power. Although he was acquitted, he became completely disillusioned with the U.S., and in 1961 became a member of the Communist Party. But that same year, he moved to Ghana. And W.E.B. Du Bois died on August 27, 1963, at the age of 95 in Ghana. The next person I'll be going over is Malcolm X. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little on May 19, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. He moved to Lansing, Michigan as a baby after the KKK made threats against his family. At age 6, his father died after being hit by a car, possibly an act of racism, and the family became poor after the rest of the family was denied death benefits. Malcolm's mother was sent to an insane asylum in 1939, and he and his siblings were sent to foster homes. In his teenage years, he got involved in petty crimes and became a drug dealer. While in prison for robbery from 1946 to 1952, he encountered teachings of Elijah Muhammad, head of the Nation of Islam, and underwent a conversion that eventually led him to the Nation of Islam, a black movement that combined elements of Islam with black nationalism. He quit smoking and gambling and refused to eat pork in keeping with the nation's dietary restrictions and followed traditions from the nation. He changed his last name to X because his previous last name may have come from white slave owners. Malcolm X met Elijah Muhammad in Chicago in 1952 and then began organizing temples for the nation in multiple cities throughout the country and founded the nation's newspaper. From 1952 to 1960, the nation grew from 400 members to 40,000 members, and X was supported by Muhammad Ali. During the Civil Rights Movement, he gave speeches at major universities and believed blacks were supposed to get their rights by, quote, any means necessary. Malcolm X criticized MLK and believed in black identity, integrity, and independence, and not integration and nonviolence as MLK had it. His views provided the foundation for the black power and black consciousness, and his politics got the attention of the FBI, who conducted surveillance of him. Malcolm X helped to change the terms from Negro and colored to black and Afro-American. In 1963, there was tension between him and Elijah Muhammad over the political direction of the nation, and Malcolm left in March 1964. The next month, he founded the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, and during his pilgrimage to Mecca that same year, he switched to Sunni Islam and returned with a new Muslim name, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. In 1965, he founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity as a secular way to internationalize the plight of black Americans, and he no longer saw the white race as the enemy of justice. Growing hostility between Malcolm and the nation led to death threats and open violence against him. He was assassinated on February 21st, 1965, while delivering a lecture, and 3 members of the nation were convicted of murder. His martyrdom led to the development of the Black Power movement. The 7th one I'll be going over is John Lewis. John Lewis was born on February 21st, 1940, in Alabama. He hated racial segregation and was disappointed when the Brown versus Board ruling didn't apply to his school life. Hearing MLK's speeches and about the Montgomery bus boycott, he got inspired to act for changes despite parents not wanting him to speak out against the Jim Crow laws. In 1957, he left Alabama to attend the American Baptist Theological Seminary in Nashville, where he learned about nonviolent protest and helped to organize sit-ins at segregated lunch places. He was arrested during the sit-ins. In 1961, he participated in the Freedom Riders, who challenged the segregated facilities they encountered at interstate bus terminals in the South. It resulted in arrests and beatings. In 1963, he became the chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee. He helped to plan the March on Washington and was the youngest speaker and said, "We all recognize the fact that if any radical social, political, and economic changes are to take place in our society, the people, the masses, must bring them about." On March 7, 1965, in response to the ineffectiveness of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, he co-led a march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, but the march was not completed and resulted in them being attacked by state troopers at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, where he suffered a fractured skull. The violent attacks were recorded, and the images were so powerful that it became known as Bloody Sunday, and it sped up the passage of the 1965 Civil Rights Act. He left the SNCC in 1960, and in 1970 he became the director of the Voter Education Project. During his tenure, he helped to register millions of marginalized voters. In 1975, he was awarded the Martin Luther King Jr. Nonviolence Peace Prize. In 1986, he was elected to the House of Representatives for Georgia's 5th District and called for health care reform, measures to fight poverty, and improvements in education. He did not attend George W. Bush's inauguration. Following the mass shooting that took place in Orlando, Florida, on June 12, 2016, he led a sit-in to try to address gun violence. He spoke out against Donald Trump and did not attend his inauguration. In December 2019, he announced that he had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and he died on July 17, 2020 in Atlanta. On the day of his funeral, at his request, the New York Times published an essay in which Lewis lauded BLM and provided marching orders for future activists. The last person I'll be going over is Barbara Jordan. Barbara Jordan was born on February 21st, 1936, in Houston, Texas. She grew up in a poor black neighborhood, and in high school, she became a good public speaker. She went to Texas Southern University in Houston, becoming a member of the debate team that tied Harvard in a debate. After graduation, she went to Boston University Law School, where she was one of 2 women to graduate. She moved to Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University, in Alabama, and taught there for 1 year before going back to Texas. She was an effective campaigner for the Democrats in the 1960 presidential election, and it propelled her into politics. In 1962 and in 1964, she unsuccessfully ran for Texas House of Representatives. But in 1966, she was elected to the Texas Senate, the first black member since 1883, and the first woman ever elected to that legislative body. Her own legislative work focused on the environment, anti-discrimination clauses in state business contracts, and urban legislation. She also helped usher in the state's first law on minimum wage and worked to create the Texas Fair Employment Practices Commission. On March 28, 1972, she became the Senate pro tempore. In 1972, she actually left the Senate when she was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from Texas' 18th District. In the House, she advocated legislation to improve the lives of marginalized communities and sponsored bills that expanded workers' compensation and strengthened the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to cover Mexican Americans in the Southwest as well as Native Americans. Despite all this, she didn't become a national figure until 1974, when participation in hearings held by the House Judiciary Committee on the impeachment of Richard Nixon was televised where she called for Nixon's impeachment. She gave the keynote address at the 1976 DNC, which confirmed her reputation as an articulate speaker. In 1979, she retired from Congress, and sometime around her retirement, she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. She was accepted a position at University of Texas, Austin, where she taught at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs until her death. In 1992, she gave another keynote address at the DNC again. In 1994, Bill Clinton awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And she died on January 17, 1996 in Austin, Texas from pneumonia. Well, I really hope you enjoyed my video. This video is not enough. You should continue to learn Black history, and in fact you should be learning Black history all year long. Try to watch some documentaries and read more things about. Thanks for watching my video. Please give this video a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so. And additionally, please follow me on Instagram and Twitter. I'll see you next time. Thank you.